John Marshall was born and raised in Fauquier County, which was considered the frontier at that time. He was born, the family lived for a while near Midland, but a little bit later, they moved to a place near Delaplane called the Hollow, which is still standing and is under reservation now. His two parents, his 9 siblings, and an Episcopal minister lived in that structure. It's hardly as large as a two-car garage. They must have slept on top of each other. They later moved to Oak Hill, which is near the town of Marshall now, and that's in private hands. Marshall received little education except being home taught and being self-taught. His career of public service began when he was 19. Shortly after shots were fired across the village green at Lexington, Massachusetts, he joined the Minute Battalion in Culpeper and supported for duty on September 1st, 1775. Marshall's war experience carried him from the Battle of Great Bridge, in what is now the city of Chesapeake here in Virginia, to the battles of Brandywine and Germantown near Philadelphia, through the winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge, to the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey on June 28, 1778. One significant aspect of Marshall's war experience really stands out. While at Valley Forge, he became part of George Washington's command group, and actually Washington's protege, and actually something that would affect the entire course of his life, and indeed the course of the history of this country. 11,000 men had reached Valley Forge, but only 8,000 departed. 13,000 died, not from British guns, but from freezing, starvation, and diseases that ran rampant through the camps because of the lack of sanitary facilities. George Washington believed that the conditions at Valley Forge were not the result of a lack of food and supplies in the country, but because the Continental Congress was too weak to find a way to provide them. Both Washington and Marshall came away from Valley Forge convinced that what this country needed was a strong central government. And after the war, they and other like-minded Americans directed their efforts toward that fulfillment. They met stiff opposition, but they ultimately prevailed, and the rest is history. Following the Battle of Monmouth, Marshall served 1 year in the Army as Deputy Judge Advocate. Awaiting a command assignment, he decided to visit his father, Captain Thomas Marshall, who was stationed at Yorktown. There, he met a young woman named Polly Ambler, whose father lived next door to Colonel Marshall. For John and Polly, it was love at first sight. But he felt he could not propose marriage then because she was only 13. He was 24. And he had no way to support a wife without getting more education. He enrolled at William & Mary and studied law under George Wythe, the country's first and most distinguished professor of law. He was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa fraternity, but after a few weeks he left William & Mary, came back to Fauquier, and was admitted to practice in August of 1780. Now, people will ask me after I say that in a speech, how could he get admitted to the practice of law after having been in law school after only a few weeks? Well, how much law there was to be learned back in those days? Not much. Patrick Henry just borrowed a law book one law book from a friend, studied that, and he passed the bar. Marshall soon told his parents he wanted to move to Richmond so he could practice in the state's high court. But he had also learned that the Adler family had moved to Richmond, and this was bound to influence his decision to make the same move. After Marshall arrived in Richmond, he started his law practice and was reunited with Polly. He waited, however, until she was 16 before proposing. When he proposed to her at her parents' home, she intended to say yes, but for some inexplicable reason, she said no. Marshall turned on his heel and said, "I'm going back to Fort Kerr to practice law." A cousin of Polly's, who lived with the Amders, heard her sobbing, and went to her and tried to console her. Picking up a pair of scissors from a nearby table, he snipped off a lock of Polly's hair and ran after Marshall with a lock of hair in his hand. Thinking Polly had sent it to him, Marshall returned to the Ambler house and reproposed. This time, Polly accepted, and they were married on January 3rd, 1783. Marshall had a locket made to contain the hair, which Polly wore around her neck until she died, and he wore it around his neck until he died. The locket is on display today in the still standing house the Marshalls built in 1792 at what is now 9th and Marshall Streets in Richmond. The locket is surpassed in its beauty only by the story of the lifelong romance between these two wonderful people. Marshall soon became a leader in the bar. He was known as a lawyer's lawyer, often employed by other attorneys to argue cases for them in the high courts of the state. He was once described as the most renowned of all the lawyers in Richmond, and another time as one of the most eminent lawyers in all of Virginia. He had the uncanny ability to get to the heart of a case, analyze it with clarity, and produce an argument both logical and persuasive. Marshall soon entered politics. In 1782, he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, then chosen by the House to serve on the Privy Council, a powerful advisory body to the governor. He was reelected to the House in 1784, but resigned in 1785 to run for the office of Attorney General of Virginia, and suffered his only political defeat. However, he was later appointed to the office when the incumbent resigned to run for governor of Virginia. Marshall was reelected to the House of Delegates and was instrumental in securing a favorable vote for a convention to consider ratification of the United States Constitution. Elected as a delegate to the convention, he was chosen by the proponents of ratification to debate Patrick Henry on the judiciary article, a very important role and also a formidable task for anyone, but especially for one so young and experienced as John Marshall. His success was reflected in a favorable vote for ratification in June 1788, and his role in the convention placed him in the forefront of Virginia politics and, at age 32, made him a prominent figure nationally. Marshall did not seek another term in the House of Delegates. However, his services were continually in demand. He rejected offers of appointment from President George Washington to be United States Attorney for Virginia, Attorney General of the United States, and a minister to France. Washington would leave the presidency without fulfilling a desire to place Marshall in high office.